How's it going, guys? Shizucats here with part 1 of my Ri'tu guide. This is a fairly straightforward arena that in my opinion will be the easiest to defeat so far, but that doesn't mean you should be unprepared. In this part, we'll be going over who I think are the best characters, mechanics, and equipment for taking on the cup. But first, a couple notes as usual. First off, Arena is extremely high level content and some of you will not be able to defeat it immediately when it gets released. However, since Arena is permanent content, feel free to come back later after you have higher levels, better equipment, or maybe just some new additions to your roster. As far as recommended levels to take on the fight, I recommend for 4-star units to be at least level 65 to 70 with at least Awakening 1, and for 5-star units you'll probably want to be at least around level 80 to 85. Secondly, this video will obviously contain spoilers for the fight, as we'll be going over certain details of the fight in order to justify the reasons why we take certain characters. If you want to go into the fight blind, close this video and come back later if you need to. Let's start with the defensive equipment. This fight is centered around physical damage, and as such, equipping all of your characters with physical defense equipment is the definite go-to. As usual, when it comes to accessories, HP is the best stat for improving the survivability of your characters, rather than using accessories that give additional defensive stats alone. On this particular patch, with the introduction of Twilight weapons that can give up to 300 HP on any weapon type except for spears, on which it gives even more HP, it should be fairly easy to have the necessary HP to survive in this arena. Depending on the length of your fights, Dragon Scarves can be an extremely helpful tool for making sure your characters have enough resources to continue casting their skills. The longer the fight, the more value you get out of these accessories. Equip Dragon Scarves to your dedicated damage dealers that you expect to have in the front line the most, since you won't be moving them to the back row as much for the natural SP regen. I typically recommend the best Beastly Scarves go on the unit behind your regen caster, and this fight is no different. The main reason to put Beastly Scarves on that unit specifically is because they cannot be the recipient of the regen, so they'll want to be able to heal through other means. Now let's get into the character recommendations. In order to determine which characters are best to bring, we should first take a look at the enemy lineup and check out their weaknesses. Ri'tu is weak to fire, wind, and light. The Dancer ad on the left is weak to sword, bow, tome, wind, and light, and the Warrior ad on the right is weak to ice and wind. Unlike the previous Farking Cup, where all 3 enemies didn't have any common weakness, the Ri'tu Cup does have a common weakness that is very easy to exploit given the current roster of available characters in EN, which is wind. With that in mind, let's get into my recommendations, starting with the MVP picks. And let me tell you, there are going to be a lot of MVP picks for this particular arena, since it's quite easy to exploit the mechanics of this fight. First up on the list should be a pretty easy choice, as she's the best available wind caster in the game by far, Odette. With access to 2-hit AoE wind, she can absolutely shred through the opposition, and once the ads are downed, she can switch to 3-hit random target for faster shield breaking on Ri'tu, as well as wind defense down, and then she can use her massive 260 power nuke once Ri'tu is broken. Honestly, any unit that's capable of casting a 2-hit AoE wind attack can be used to great effect in this fight. Tiki Len would be my next best choice for 5 stars, especially with her exclusive accessory if you farmed it, as her low SP cost let her consistently throw out attacks even if the fight goes long, and she can cast 4-hit wind spells in the late stages of the fight for fast breaks. Noelle is a fantastic 4-star unit for this fight, who also has AoE wind defense down to make your wind allies' attacks hit even harder. Tressa is another unit with access to 2-hit wind AoE, as well as defensive options in taunt and sidestep, which can prove very useful against a team full of physical attackers. However, I should warn you that the enemy damage output can be extremely high when it's all focused on a single character, even potentially hitting Tressa from 100 to 0 within a single turn, so I would recommend against using her taunt during the early stages of the fight when all 3 enemies are still up. That being said, there is one tank that I personally find to be extremely effective in this fight, and it's not Gilderoy, it's actually Devon, the 4-star merchant. In addition to having a 1-hit AoE wind attack, what makes Devon really shine in this fight is that he has a non-AoE taunt. By using the taunt on just a single enemy, it takes some of the pressure off your other allies, without allowing the entire enemy team to rail him down from 100 to 0. Once the ads are down, he can switch to using his AoE taunt that comes with defense up, to make sure that he's protected against Ritu's extremely high damage late into the fight. His innate regen also makes it very easy for him to stay extremely healthy even after taking a lot of punishment. As far as regen casters go, any of them are useful for their regen alone, but in particular, Agnes is a fantastic choice for her ability to apply team-wide physical defense up as well as use wind magic, making her my number 1 pick for the role. As always, having debuffers to reduce the enemy attack is a top priority. Viola is the premier debuffer with access to anti-attack, anti-guard, as well as double wide burst. But Kurtz is an excellent budget option due to also having access to anti-attack. In this fight in particular, he can use his wind edge to great effect, since it is a wind attack that also applies wind defense down. Stacking this with another ally's wind defense down, such as Odette's or Noelle's, can result in some really big damage. One other notable debuffer that I've actually tried using is a character you probably didn't see coming, Feline, the 3-star thief. With access to an AoE 10% attack down, she can reduce the incoming damage of all enemies while simultaneously extending the duration of your other debuffer's anti-attack, which takes some of the burden off of them to have to reapply it. Next, let's check out some of the other available attacking options. Heathcote is another unit that can make use of 2-hit AoE wind via his Storm Burst, and can also use Triple Burst if needed to lower enemy shields just a little bit faster. That being said, his damage won't be quite as high due to not having the greatest stat line for casting spells, on top of his weapon type from his class not being really suited for casting magic either. Stormburst also has a very high SP cost because of its shield crack component, which isn't even being utilized here since all of the enemies are natively weak to wind. While Fabio doesn't have a 2-hit wind AoE, he does have a strong 1-hit AoE that's a perfectly fine attacking option, and also has 3-hit wind random target to quickly drop Ritu's shields once she's alone. He can also apply a magic up buff to the full front row, which, while not the strongest buff around, being only at 10%, can be a nice boost to the team's overall damage. With very few common weaknesses between the 3 enemies outside of wind, it's a bit harder to pinpoint other strong attacking units. One unit that stands out to me is Idea, who can use 3-hit sword attacks on the left ad and go into Heaven's Gate against Ri'tu once the ads are down. Additionally, she has access to a taunt skill as well as natively high physical defense that can allow her to shrug off enemy attacks, but just like Tressa, take care to not let her get 100 to 0'd. While both Ri'tu and the Dancer ad are both weak to light, the Warrior ad will constantly put up a cover stance, taking hits for Ri'tu, making AoE light skills noticeably worse in this fight. However, if you can bring light units that have other utilities such as healing, buffs, or debuffs, they can be pretty useful characters to have around. Such characters include Millard, who can apply burst healing to the party, Hasumi, who can apply healing as well as defensive buffs, and Eliza, who can be stationed behind one of your windcasters to make them deal even more damage, in addition to having some healing options of her own. There is another light unit that stands out for me, but for a completely different reason. Miles, the 4-star warrior. Miles has a passive that gives the unit in front of him extra physical defense, making him a great unit to stick behind a tank such as Devon to make sure they're not getting KO'd. If needed, he can also use his sword attacks on the Dancer ad or his 1-hit light on either Ri'tu or the Dancer as well. Menno is another fantastic utility unit that you can potentially bring along. In particular, they can use a 20% AoE wind defense down debuff that can stack with Noelle's and allows for a 30% capped wind defense down on all enemies, greatly boosting your entire wind lineup's damage output. Buffers can be an excellent addition to your composition as well, with offensive buffers like Lynette boosting up your team's overall damage, or defensive buffers such as Glossom contributing to your team's defensive survivability. Next, let's take a look at a couple sample compositions. As usual, the first is the comp that I used myself when I beat Ri'tu for the first time, and she was actually the first arena that I defeated. I used Agnes as my regen caster. She was the only regen caster I had at the time, but fit the role perfectly due to also having wind magic and team-wide physical defense up. My main attacker in this composition was actually just Heathcote, and the setup I used honestly looks pretty wacky looking back at it. I would have definitely used Noelle as a main attacker instead of putting her behind Devon, but maybe the team's survivability wasn't high enough to go without Millard healing between the enemy actions. Despite having Gilderoy in my roster at the time I beat Ri'tu, I found more success with Devon for the reasons I mentioned earlier. For a much more optimized setup with a bit higher unit quality, I constructed this team. Odette would be the optimal unit to go in either Tikilen or Tressa's spot in my opinion, but I don't have her and they'll do the job just fine. This team is all about spamming wind multi-hits over and over and staying alive through the enemy onslaught of physical damage. In Feline's slot, Lynette can be brought for a more aggressive approach, but you give up some extra safety that you would otherwise have from Feline's AoE attack down. And that wraps up my first part of my Ri'tu guide. Part 2 going over the fight in detail should be up in a couple days, and I plan to post the next character overview as my next video in the meantime. Hopefully you guys have a pretty good idea of how to best tackle this arena, but as always, if you still have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below. Until next time, this has been CotC. See ya!